Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the northern parts in the Bakhmut direction, where we see that the Russian forces managed to advance in the direction of Vesele as well as in the direction of Robotyne, as the Russian forces here pressured the Ukrainian positions to the north of Soledar, which is an area where they have been trying to advance here by Avdiivka as well, where they've been advancing through the railways. So with this, we see that they are now pushing westwards from these railway positions, and at the same time they're advancing here to the southwest of Vesele and in the direction of Robotyne, which shows that they are planning some sort of pincer move where they'll try to advance through the central parts in between the two villages while advancing from behind Vesele, trying to flank it and pincer Vesele, as well as pressure Robotyne to isolate it from Vesele. So we're seeing that there is this operation by the Russian forces here in the north trying to gain control over Vesele. The fighting here of the Russian forces is against the Ukrainian positions here by Siversk and their forces in this area. Whoever is the commanding officer of the Ukrainian forces by Siversk seems to be the most competent commander of the Ukrainian forces, as so far he's been the only one who's been able to stabilize the front line. He's even managed to gain control over Avdiivka after the Russians captured it, and since then there's been a lot of positional fightings in this direction, but there's been no territorial changes. So with this we can see that the Ukrainian commander here is very competent and is able to divert the Russian forces in the area. There is also the fact that the Ukrainian forces here actually outnumbered the Russian forces, which as the only area really throughout the whole front line. There's also the possibility of the Bakhmut direction, but it seems that with the recent Russian reinforcements in this area, they now outnumber the Ukrainian forces. And in that sense, we also see these advancements. There are 4 separate advancements by the Russian forces. Here to the west of Romove, they have managed to advance and capture these forest lines and fortifications, trenches east of the car racing track here in this direction. There's also a lot of trenches and fortifications here by the Romove road, which the Wagner forces prior to the Ukrainian offensive managed to gain control of partially. But now the Ukrainian forces have full control over them and the Russian forces are now attacking these positions. So the current front line is located right by these fortifications. As such, the fighting that is going to take place in this whole area here is going to be very heavy, as the Ukrainian forces have fortifications in all of these areas. Therefore, we see that the Russian forces' strategy seems to be an attack head-on towards the Ukrainian positions, a flank here to the north by the railways, trying to get behind the Ukrainian positions, the supply lines, etc., ahead of the fortifications, and a flank here to the south from the direction of Romove. With this, we see a 3-pointer pincer maneuver trying to get around the Ukrainian defenses while storming them head on and try to cut them off from their supply lines. As such, we see that there's a lot of movement by the Russian forces in all of these directions to try and get and improve their positions to get a head start on the Ukrainian forces and pressure them from these 3 different directions. The main challenge is going to be in the western parts through Avdiivka, where the Ukrainian forces will have heavy fortifications and defenses through and from Avdiivka. But again, here we see a similar tactic by the Russian forces attacking from 3 different directions, where one of their focuses is actually from the railways as well. So this is a 2-pronged offensive maneuver where they'll go both northwards towards Avdiivka and southwards to cut off the supply lines to the Ukrainian fortifications here by the road. And at the same time, there's also these attacks by the north of Avdiivka and in the direction of Robotyne. So generally, this whole northern flank of Bakhmut is facing attacks from the Russian forces from all directions, all throughout the front line, with active offensive operations by the Russian forces. As such, we see that the Russian forces have concentrated a large amount of soldiers here in the northern parts. These attacks are mainly infantry-based, but there's also armored support and heavy artillery support, allowing them to deploy their firepower advantage here in the north. We then move on to the Avdiivka direction, where there's been reports of heavy fighting here in the forest areas, of which we get this video here. In this video, we see a Russian drone flying over the forest area, which is completely bare, with the lack of leaves all throughout the forest line. As such, we see that despite the cover that the forest area provides, these drones are still able to get a proper view over the area. We see that there's constant artillery on the Ukrainian positions and fortifications in this forest area in preparation for the Russian forces launching any form of attack in this direction. We then move on to the Robotyne direction and Minka directions. First off, in the Minka direction, we see a video here which shows a Russian FPV drone hitting Ukrainian positions by the Minka area. And from this video, we see that the Ukrainian forces are still present here in the eastern parts of the northern part of Minka. With this, the Russian forces have full control over the southern parts, but the northern parts is still contested in the outskirts of Minka. So this whole area is actually part of Minka. As such, the Russians do not have full control over the city. They are still lacking these outskirts, but the main part of the city itself is all under Russian control. As for the Robotyne direction, we see this advancement by the Russian forces. Of these advancements, we also have this geolocated footage which shows that the Russian forces are storming the trenches here to the south of Robotyne. And with these advancements, the Russian forces are now getting closer to reaching Robotyne itself. The fortifications here to the south of it allows the Russian forces to advance and attack on any of the Ukrainian positions within the southern parts of the village. And with the Russian positions here to the west as well, Robotyne is becoming increasingly under heavy pressure by the Russian forces. If the Russian forces manage to regain control over Robotyne, they'll have regained control over the majority of what the Ukrainians have managed to capture, as with control over Robotyne, which oversees all of the fields here to the north and to the east of the village, they'll be able to attack the Ukrainian forces with direct fire all throughout the front line in this whole salient. And with that, the Russian forces could launch an offensive here to the northwest of Robotyne in the direction of Avdiivka, cut off the main road, and advance here from the northern parts with cover fire from Robotyne, and then move eastwards to try and cut off the Ukrainian forces in these locations and regain full control over the salient here in the Robotyne direction. So we're seeing increasing efforts by the Russian forces to attack the flanks and directly attack Robotyne itself. We then move on to the Neer River area, where here in the direction of Krinky, here to the northeast of Kherson city, we see that the Russian forces attempted an offensive operation in the direction of the village, and in this operation they actually failed to regain control over Krinky. They instead lost a lot of their units. As we see in this geolocated footage here, the Ukrainian forces managed to hit the Russian deployment vehicles, armored infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers with their own artillery, and preventing them from advancing much closer than what we see here with the geolocated footage. And we also have this compilation of losses of the Russian forces in the direction of Krinky. This compilation of losses shows multiple tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers all throughout the Krinky direction. And with this, we actually see that despite Russian efforts, they are unable to push out the Ukrainian forces from the Krinky direction. This is mainly due to two parts. The first one is that the Ukrainian forces have a large concentration of artillery units in this direction, and Russian forces have been forced to divert their own artillery forces to other parts of the front line where they're conducting their own offensive operations. So while the Ukrainians have an advantage in artillery here, the Ukrainian forces have a disadvantage in artillery by Bakhmut, by Avdiivka, where the Russian forces have a significantly higher amount of artillery for their uses. The main reason for this is how far the Krinky area is from the front line, and likely the Russian forces sees it as a smaller threat than fighting by Zaporizhzhia, Avdiivka, and Bakhmut, etc. So we're seeing that the Ukrainian forces here are likely being underestimated by the Russian forces, and as such, the Ukrainian forces are able to withstand these counterattacks by the Russian forces to try and regain control over the Neer River area. So with this, we see that the Russian forces are trying to deploy units nearby the village to try and get a better position and try to kick out the Ukrainian forces, but they aren't really preparing properly, and as such, the Ukrainian forces are able to hold back their advances and are still holding on to most of the village. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.